Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Brock Beard from LastCar.info, and welcome to Behind the Wall, coming after the conclusion of the United Rentals 500 at Phoenix, where unofficially, pending the results of post-race inspection, William Byron has now won his second consecutive Cup race this season, the first driver to win multiple races this year, which would give him the overall lead in the standings for this season. BJ McLeod has his first last place finish of the season. So we'll definitely talk about all of that as well as the Xfinity race. Just so you know, shows could be a little bit shorter this evening. I cannot resist the absolute disaster fest that the Oscars are, so we'll do this before then. Speaking of disasters, a terrible sequence of events for Kevin Harvick, who very clearly seemed to be on his way towards his first win of the season and a chance to return to this Phoenix track in November to try to win his second championship in what could potentially be his final career Cup race. All signs seem to indicate that's going to be the case. But unfortunately, things didn't quite shake out that way. A late race caution caused by Harrison Burton's flat tire resulted in a late race restart and had a different situation there for the outcome there. But definitely still, I think Harvick, despite the fact that he didn't pull off the victory here, and again, circumstances just outside his control with the Harrison Burton spin, it still seemed like, they got a good showing. They got some good stuff going over there. They showed his results from earlier this year and having some great finishes there and still at least being in the mix. And I think served notice that he can have a very good shot at this. Keep in mind, of course, last year, it was much later in the season that he was actually racking off victories there with the wins at Michigan and Richmond. And so now him showing this much promise early on, especially with his teammates at Stewart-Haas seeming to struggle as much as they are, I think that speaks very well for him there. As I said on Twitter there, I really predicted that, if Harvick won this race, they were pretty much going to sell this race out earlier today here, and I still feel like that's still definitely a possibility. The reason I was saying that is we ordered Last Bro's ticket a little bit earlier this year, and even then they were saying that they were already selling out for it, and I think that was even before the season started, but probably after Harvick's announcement that this is going to be his last season. So we'll find out how things shake out on that end there. Still in the meantime here, good run for William Byron. He and Kyle Larson utterly dominated this race, much as they had at the Vegas race last week. It seemed like it was only going to be a matter of time as to which one would actually pull it off. Larson seemed to have certainly the advantage. I mean, how many times we hear during this broadcast that he was the prohibitive favorite to win this race, given his performance in both practice and qualifying. And for much of the race, we did actually see that. He had a fine showing out there, but just didn't quite have the right strategy there at the end. And in point of fact, was caught during a long green flag run by Harvick and having a really good battle there towards the end of the race. I know I tweeted Clint it up there during the Crank It Up segment that Boyer interrupted. But again, I don't really have any issue with the fact that he did. I was glad that somebody was there to respond to this move on the track. Made me wonder why they even bothered doing a Crank It Up to begin with, knowing that Harvick was catching Larson that much. I think it would have been much more effective if they actually focused on the interval between those two drivers and not treat it like a complete surprise that he came out of nowhere and made that pass. So I actually give credit to Boyer, frankly, for being on the ball and actually responding to it when it happened. I think it's just that much more ridiculous that they did a Crank It Up segment where he was even within earshot. And I guess at Phoenix, you could say, is this going to happen in the next 2 laps or 5 laps, or is it going to take 20 laps for this to set up? But still, I think if you have something exciting that's building, it would be good if they actually paid a bit more attention to that. I'm reminded so much of last year's Richmond race where Denny Hamlin getting the lead on short pitting there at the end of that race was treated like so much of a surprise and just didn't know where he came from and weren't even talking about him. It's like these are stories that need to be kind of brought up a bit more and maybe just a change of approach, kind of be a little more proactive rather than reactive to what's actually happening out there and see when a story is building up. So again, as much as I'm not a big fan of Clint Boyer, I thought he did a fine job of actually at least drawing their attention, at least in the moment. We got to have that moment there. So that was good. again, I think I don't know whether it was a director's call or what that they did to crank it up at that moment. I think that's the part that I think it's still worthy of being a little bit critical about. I know Mike Joy mentioning keyboard warriors there when it came to the commercial break there was a bit of that too. I wonder how much is the responsiveness of, I know that they get no shortage of complaints about the broadcast, and I certainly contribute a lot to that too. But I don't think a lot. I think the sense that a lot of it is just trolling, or a lot of it is unnecessary, complaining, or that it's not taking into considerations things that maybe they understand that we don't. I still don't buy that. I think there's other ways to make the commercial breaks a little bit less invasive. Even hear this from Denny Hamlin's podcast too, where it's like, we have to have the stages because that's when we're gonna have the commercial breaks. It's like, well, that would make sense if the commercial breaks were only at the stage cautions, which they aren't. And it would make sense also if we had side-by-side more often, which we don't, because we still have the full screen commercials. There's still stuff that just hasn't been negotiated as effectively as in other sports. And what that's going to take to actually, make that less of an issue, I don't exactly know. But I know that however they have it set up now, as just a complete hodgepodge of side-by-side commercials and full screen commercials, and trying to stack them up earlier in the broadcast or not doing it, or at Daytona where it was just complete overload and the race just felt very fractured because you're not able to get in the flow of what's actually happening. Something different needs to be made from that. So again, I got no problem with Mike Joy. I certainly understand his frustration having been in the sport as long as he has. And I know there's a lot of people that are very aggressive on the internet with their complaints about this stuff too. I can imagine that would get exhausting after a while there. But I do think that at least there's more that's going on than just that. Speaking of that, and this was covered better in this broadcast than I think the last two incidents here. We have to talk about the rim failure that happened on Aric Almirola's car during this race. We did see, and this was confirmed by the Stewart-Haas team when they posted it, that, again, it was the very same kind of rim failure that we did see out of these cars last year, when it was Justin Haley at the Daytona 500 and Corey LaJoie at Phoenix. In both those cases, there are shots of just a ring, a part of the rim, that was still left like dragging underneath the hub as the car came down pit road. Now, in this case here, there was additional video evidence. We actually, for the first time, unlike those previous two incidents, we got to see the actual rest of the rim out there on the track. And also in this particular case, it appears that the wheel nut did come off before the rest of the rim failed, which is why they still enacted the 2-lap penalty. I don't know if this was the same case in the Haley and LaJoie situations last year. Be interesting to find out. I know we had the same penalties. They were in both cases, those were treated the same way as a loose wheel on pit road. I'd be interested to find out. But again, that lack of transparency we didn't see last year, I think, was a real big effect of that. But I think that what does need to be understood in its place is like, okay, now we've seen all the pieces of it here. And apparently when a central wheel nut comes loose, there is a chance that maybe the wheel doesn't just come off altogether, like we see in some of these situations, like under caution, Truex at Fontana, for example. But there's a situation where the rim itself could be damaged in such a way that the rim separates from the tire. And one part, and what seemed like, too, from a lot of the pictures that we're seeing, that ring that is pinned underneath the hub appears to be the inside part of the rim, like the actual flange that's connecting it to the tire. Apparently that becomes a weak point, and then that fails. The rest of the rim comes out separate from the tire. We're not even talking about like a flat tire necessarily, and the loud noise that it created. I mean, Mike Joy sounded audibly startled by it when it happened directly in front of the press box there in the case of Almirola's incident. So I'd like to know more about, this particular issue here and how, there's two aspects to this here. First of all, this happened a bit later in a run here for Almirola's team. So is this really a situation where that nut wasn't screwed down all entirely? Because I don't think it is, because if that were the case, the whole wheel and tire would have come off at the same time. Why is there this separation? Why is there this failure of one part of the rim, and then the rim and tires separate from each other. Like, why is that? Why is this such a peculiarly different situation than, again, like Truex at Fontana, Bubba Wallace at, what was it, Coda last year, several other examples where the tire and wheel come off at exactly the same time. The tire and the rim are all like one piece. That's something I think it needs to be understood a lot more, because my concern is, if that's the case, if there's a failure modality where the rim is able to come separate from the tire, then I'm thinking there's something that's probably going to cause that wheel nut to come loose, even if it's secured. I think that's the other issue. Is there an issue in the locking mechanism of the little lug nut there, of the wheel nut, that's causing it to back off, and then that leads to, at higher speeds, this particular failure? Again, there needs to be more transparency from NASCAR on this. I hope they've hung on to that rim and the piece of it there and try to really understand what's happening, and maybe add more context to what happened to Haley and LaJoie last year. Because I think that's really troubling. I think that's something else that needs to be looked at. Luckily, it's not a weekly occurrence. This is only the third occurrence I can remember this happening in more than a year. But that's enough times that it's happened now that I think it still should be on that same list with the other issues of the next-gen car, and I think it needs to be treated more seriously. I applaud Fox for being a little more comprehensive in showing it, although they did really, really not want to show the actual incident with this wheel, that it took them a very long time to actually show that the tire and the rim had separated, and that, but this time we actually got to see the rim sitting in the middle of the track, which we didn't see in the previous ones there. I'm not crazy about that, because that kind of seems to indicate to me that, there's somebody else with their thumb on this to make sure that it doesn't get seen. And I know there's already been some discussion about this since Fontana with the Allmendinger accident and the delay in showing an incident versus, it being live. I think there's some incidents where that's not really a problem, but I think when it's coming to something like this, I think that's another thing to kind of look at there, too. And yes, and Nicholas Gray, you bring up a good point too. Yeah, the Xfinity's getting these wheels too. I think that's another thing to kind of look at, at the exact same time. So, yeah, I think that's another thing to kind of look at that. But, yeah, so I mean, a little bit of controversy there at the same time. I think with the short track package itself, I think right now the results, I'd say, are inconclusive. We saw Alex Bowman make a hell of a save off of turn 2, which was correctly brought up there during the broadcast, and showing the car in a full 4-wheel drift, sliding up the banking there without making any contact there. I think that was a very surprising situation there. I'm sure it no doubt surprised him in fighting that car around the track. But good for him and actually, making that save. And other than that, I'm not sure how much of a direct effect this had on the actual racing itself. I know restarts are definitely the thing at Phoenix. It is always like the big advertisement that everybody just dive bombs down to that apron and tries to, either push somebody else into that pit wall at the pit exit, or, throw your car back onto the banking there in the corner. And even in a race like this, where we didn't really have that many restarts till the end of it, it didn't really play out that same way. I don't know if that allowed for a situation like Kevin Harvick to be able to make that long race run to actually track down Kyle Larson for the lead or not. I don't know if it made anything any easier. I was a little concerned from listening to BJ McLeod's radio that he was immediately reminded of issues that his car had in other races earlier this season that ran completely different packages, something much closer to what we had last season. The fact that he had the fuel pump issue, for one thing, that doesn't really have anything to do with handling, but the fact that his car was hopping back and forth, kind of like he felt at the Clash. I don't know if that's similar to the vibration that Connor Daly had in the duels back at Daytona, but maybe that's something else that kind of gets looked at there. They did say over McLeod's radio that it was hitting the rear tires, the rear shocks, really hard out there, and that it became a pretty uncomfortable ride. I was kind of amazed that McLeod was running the car as well as he was, even racing Cody Ware in the opening laps of this race, before ultimately the loss of fuel pressure was what put him out of the event. But I think that's another thing to kind of look at. I don't know if this aero package affected that at all. I'll be interested to see how this plays out at a track like Martinsville, or once we get to the road courses. We got Coda coming up in a couple weeks. I don't think we're going to see as much of an effect at the road courses, But I think at the short tracks, maybe we'll have a bit more. Hopefully Martinsville, Richmond, tracks like that, it'll be interesting. We did not see any exercise of the damp track package. We did have the windshield wipers on the cars for the Xfinity and the Cup cars. Neither became necessary at this point here, so we'll wait. That of course, we don't have any statistics on that here coming up at the beginning. But yeah, I think that's another, that's another thing. It just kind of remains to be seen on the rest of the season. At the end of the race, and Fox did show a replay of this after first mentioning it on here, there was a last lap incident between Denny Hamlin and Ross Chastain coming through turns 1 and 2. Hamlin appeared to completely lose control of his car and slid up the track into Chastain, putting them both into the fence. They ended up dropping back to the 23rd and 24th spots at the finish of this race. Hamlin ahead of Chastain, them being 4.1 and 4.4 seconds back in the lead. The next car in front of him, Daniel Suarez, was 2.7 seconds back in the lead, so between about 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds behind the 22nd place finisher there. I'm sure we'll probably hear more about this on Denny's podcast here in the near future and what exactly happened at the end of that there. It looked like, I don't know exactly what tire strategy Hamlin was on. I guess he was on 2 tires because he was still among the cars that was ahead of Harvick there at the last couple of restarts. Car just came unstuck. Chastain was kind of having, both of them really, Hamlin and Chastain were kind of having decent runs. Actually, they were the fantasy picks that Last Bro and I had. And it seemed like they were at least going to be top 10 cars, not at all factors for the lead, but every once in a while finding their way in the top 5. But, it seemed like they were at least going to get maybe 8th and 9th, but ultimately that didn't work out too well for either of them in the end result there. We saw Eric Jones towards the front there at one point. Pit strategy didn't work out for him. He ends up back in the 21st spot. Got to say kudos to 2311 Racing, especially with Tyler Reddick. If memory serves, this was the race in, I think, 2021 that we started to see 2311 really start to get their feet under him when Bubba Wallace had a great run and unfortunately was undone by pit strategy in there. Seemed like he was going to have a top 10 or maybe even a shot at a top 5 in that event. We saw the very same out of Reddick in this race. Last year when Reddick was driving for Childress, he very nearly took the win away from Chase Briscoe and was pretty much the biggest challenger that Briscoe had at the finish. This year with a different team and having a just miserable start to the year. Somebody pointed out that he still came into this race with fewer points than Travis Pastrana earned in the Daytona 500, or I guess would have if he was full-time this year. Reddick had a good run, seemed like he got his way into the top 10, held on to like a top 5 for most of this. Still comes out with a 3rd place finish in this one. Fantastic showing out of him. Another driver that I think people were probably anticipating what he was going to be doing in this after he was playing as Joey Logano's tail gunner in the championship race last year was Ryan Blaney. Kyle Petty came out and made comparisons between Blaney and Casey Kane and saying that it was, just potential that's just not been fulfilled. I mean, more or less. I'm paraphrasing here. But basically criticizing what Blaney has accomplished in his career so far versus the potential that he has with the quality ride that he has. I thought that was kind of interesting. It's an interesting comparison. I don't think you could really fully evaluate that until he's retired like Kane is. And even Kane had a season like 2006 where he and Evernham Motorsports just completely took off. And also you think back to 2004, even before that, where at Rockingham, a very challenging track, he came very close to winning his first race. He did have a situation where he had to finish second a lot of times before winning, which is a little different from Blaney, I would say. I know not everything's going to be a 1-to-1 here in the comparison, but I think it kind of sells both drivers a little bit short. I think Kane, when he was really good, was able to be utterly dominant. I think both these drivers are perhaps drivers like Martin Truex that just count on having a performance where they're able to just utterly dominate everybody else and they can't catch them. I think that probably the part of the racecraft they struggle with, if anything, is races like we had today, where it's a lot of pit strategy at the end. You have a lot of late race restarts, some starting and stopping, some red light and green light. I think there's some drivers that aren't very good at that, and maybe they're from either an older school mentality, or maybe a longer, a driver's, longer ago. I think a guy like William Byron is very good at races like this, where it's like starting and stopping. Although at the same time, yeah, I mean, obviously in these last 2 rounds, he's also been able to dominate a great deal of these races too. But I'm thinking of like drivers like Martin Truex or Mark Martin before him, where, you don't even have these, these last minute restarts, and the driver just, cruises to a win of like multiple seconds. Races like tracks at Michigan or Fontana or things like that. Those are tracks that I think, a driver like Ryan Blaney would do very well. And also tracks that I think Casey Kane did very well during his career. That, he just kind of just completely wearing people down. And, but a driver like that, I don't think they're going to do as many of those really ridiculous, crazy moves like a Ross Chastain would. Like even, William Byron to an extent. He's not the first one I would think of. A Kyle Busch would probably do, even though he's kind of more of a veteran. Drivers like that, I think, would be more suited towards, races like this, where things just kind of get thrown out the window, and it's just a matter of whoever gets to the finish line first. That's a different kind of racecraft, and we've seen it become more common, even in a race like today, where it seemed like it was going to be a long distance race, very calm and so forth there. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't really fully agree. I think the biggest thing I disagree with the Kyle Petty statement is that I don't think that's as much of a negative. I wouldn't go to the extent of it being like a potential that's unfulfilled. I think it's perhaps a signifier of what it takes to be successful in these cup races. I think probably the best balance would be somewhere in between, because you're going to have some races that are going to be long green flag runs, and you got to have interesting strategy. And you're also going to have some races where it's going to be multiple green, white checkers, and it's going to be red light, green light. I think if you're able to make that adjustment very well, I think that would be the most complete driver that runs in the Cup these days. And again, I think maybe a guy like Kyle Busch is really good in that. Maybe I don't know. I'm struggling to think of somebody else that's consistently shown that. You could certainly argue Byron from these last couple weeks, since they've been races that he's had to both dominate and survive multiple restarts. Hard to say, but I think that's another one to kind of look at there at the same time. Let's see here. So looking at the rest of the results, but I mentioned Blaney because runner-up finish for him, easily the best he'd been running all day, being able to kind of break up the Hendrick party at the front. Second place finish for him. Margin of victory unofficially shown as 33 hundredths of a second. So kudos to Blaney for getting a good run. The other thing that was reminding me with the Blaney and the Kyle Petty thing, I was wondering, I almost thought of picking Blaney for this race because I was thinking back to 2006. There was a moment where Jeff Burton was driving for Richard Childress Racing. I remember this distinctly. It was going into the Dover race, and there was some kind of quote. There was something about Jeff Burton being either washed up, or there was some problem with his team, or he was going to lose his sponsor, he was going to lose his ride. There was some kind of thing about Jeff Burton that came out, and that same week, Jeff Burton just lit a fire under Jeff, and he went out there and he just like crushed the field in there. And I think that was his last win, or one of his last wins. I guess he won. That was still in the singular car, so I think his last win was still in the Caterpillar car afterwards, if I'm remembering it properly. But I was wondering if that was going to happen this week with Ryan Blaney, that this thing with Kyle Petty would come out, and then you get an "I'll show you" moment, and he just comes out and just crushes the field. Clearly, Blaney didn't have the best car in this race, but he did have the best strategy at the end to kind of work it out and be among these drivers like Tyler Reddick to mix things up. But clearly not as good of a strategy as what Byron ultimately had in pulling off the victory here in the race today. Christopher Bell coming back, one of many drivers that came back from pit road penalties in this race, finishing in the 6th spot here. Chase Briscoe in 7th. Kyle Busch comes back into 8th. Alex Bowman in 9th. And Josh Berry, who was about 15th place, about a third of the way through the race. Great job by him. Gets his first career Cup Series top 10, finishing in the 10th spot, driving in Chase Elliott's car. I mean, yes, you think back to 2020 and Chase Elliott winning the championship here at Phoenix. Yes, Elliott was very much a factor in trying to defend that championship. Well, not immediately after, but in 2022, going for it here before the incident with Chastain on the front straightaway. But a fine showing out of Berry. I think there was a lot of skepticism. I think it was a little bit premature about that 29th place run that Barry had last week. I will admit that I was part of that. I really thought they were going to put Allgaier in that car. I got the Justin Allgaier shirt on today, in fact. I was thinking that Allgaier was going to be in that car because Allgaier has a better record at Phoenix, including the championship last year. I figured it was going to be a rotation of drivers. But when Josh Berry was signed on to run the rest of the ovals, as it was announced earlier this week, until Elliott's expected return, which sounds like they said, about 6 weeks. So potentially the 600 here coming up in a couple months. Once Barry was locked up for the ovals, it's like, okay, well, yeah, give him a shot. I mean, we're going to have a variety of different tracks here. It's only going to help him for when he does eventually get in the Cup, and I do believe he will. I'm not exactly sure where, because it doesn't seem like anybody's going anywhere at Hendrick in terms of losing their seats. But yeah, a fine showing out of him here. I think that'll at least quiet some of his doubters coming along here. I know he's not the most spectacular driver out there. Maybe we could put him in the same category as a guy like Ryan Blaney or so forth. But he definitely showed that he still belongs in the show, or at least a shot at it with this run today. Yes, some craziness had to happen, but it wasn't so much craziness that I think it needs to be dismissed outright. We're not talking a super speedway race here, where I know there's a lot of doubters and second guessers that come from a lot of that. I think that was a fine showing, especially since it was on par with a day where Hendrick in general was having a fantastic day, where Larson and Byron crushed the field under their heel of their shoe there for a second straight round. So I think that's another thing to kind of look at too. Looking through the lineup there, Bubba Wallace back in 14th. Again, I'm sure he's going to be a bit disappointed in that, given the fact that, he's had some good runs here. And again, his teammate, of course, having a fine showing. Ryan Preece was in 12th. Didn't really get mentioned really much during the broadcast there, but a good showing out of him of the 41 team. Probably one of the best runs we've seen out of that car since his standout performance in the Clash earlier this year. Brad Keselowski ended up dropping back in the order, which is too bad. The Roush Fenway Keselowski guys seem like they really kind of turned things around this year. For Keselowski in particular, this is definitely a big improvement over when his car caught on fire in the fall race here. But an 18th place run is unfortunately all that the 6 team has. And his teammate Chris Buescher just 3 spots ahead of him there. And then, of course, we mentioned the incidents with Chastain and Hamlin at the end of the race. So kind of mentioned again, BJ McLeod being your last place finisher, and the issue of fuel pumps is becoming more of a story. That became a problem really from the beginning of this year, not always in our last place battles, but from other drivers along the way. It's kind of bizarre to kind of figure out what the exact problem is, because I'm not the most technically minded person. I'd really like to understand, if we did like a Ford cutaway car thing during these races, the differences between a Cup Series fuel pump and an Xfinity Series one. Because in the Cup one here today, BJ McLeod's crew was talking much more about a chip. So some kind of computerized or electronic system that they had to try to kind of replace on this fuel pump to get it working. That they were able to get it to work, but it still didn't have the car kick over. Versus a cable-drawn system that we had in the Xfinity Series race, both for the last place runs that we saw out of Dawson Cram on the Xfinity side and Joey Gase in the Vegas race last week. In both cases, a cable either came apart or failed or broke at some point. That this cable is actually held in by some kind of a nut that's attached to the unit. This was a particular issue, and we're kind of jumping ahead to Xfinity here, but in Alex... I didn't mean Alex LeVay. I mean Dawson Cram's situation here on the number 74 there for the CHK racing effort. They actually had to get a nut off of an air cleaner to try to fix it on there. And then apparently, I don't know if that fix failed or if there was some other problem with the cord, but ultimately that wasn't able to get him to the finish of the race, and he had to pull off the track around the halfway point there and fall out of the event. I'm curious as to what's causing these failures. BJ McLeod himself had a very similar issue. He mentioned back in our interview at Fontana, this happened at Daytona, was the reason that he was multiple laps down, and that even with all the late race attrition, he wasn't able to climb any further than 30th as a result, which was too bad because he had a fast car in the duels. I'm not exactly sure what's causing these issues. BJ was very clear in saying that these aren't really small team issues. So, of course, with spec parts, I guess, there's only so many places you can get any one of these parts, including the inner workings of the car, not just the body pieces and the way the frame is set up and so forth. But I'd be interested to kind of really understand what's causing these failures. As I was mentioning this, I do recall some other situations with fuel pumps in the Gen 6 era. I think Timmy Hill had a really good run at Martinsville that went sideways. Unfortunately, that was during COVID, so we didn't really hear or get a lot of information as to what the exact failure situation was there. But whatever the situation is, however far back it goes, we're seeing it now in consecutive weeks, and I'm wondering if this is going to be something that's going to be more of a problem, with with particular teams out there. It does seem like it's affecting smaller teams in these cases that we're seeing, but I don't know how much of that is just the preference that I'm seeing on this, where I'm watching the last place finishers versus anybody that's having a problem with it, maybe in the midfield or maybe just outside the top 10, and they just kind of, deal with it or fix it on a pit stop, or they have access to parts that maybe the small teams don't have. That would be interesting to find out. I don't know if we're going to get any progress on that, but I think that's another thing to certainly look at the same time. But BJ McLeod, your last place finisher, Harrison Burton's flat tire that caused that series of late race cautions dropped him all the way to 35th. He was one lap behind Cody Ware in that situation there. So Harrison Burton in the bottom 5, Cody Ware 34th, Almirola 33rd. Lost 4 laps, apparently, I guess, after the toe link issue that was resulting from that issue with the tire. He was able to get back out there and finish 4 laps down. Todd Gilliland rounding out the bottom 5, his first start for Rick Ware Racing, as he now shares the number 38 entry with Zane Smith for a few races this year. Zane just ahead of him in the 31st spot, 2 laps down. So not a significant difference between the 38 and the 15 in this week. So we'll see how that shakes out in these races coming up ahead. We'll go back into the Xfinity race here because I already kind of talked about that. Dawson Cram getting his first ever last place finish in a very early career in both the Truck Series and the Xfinity Series. Him driving the number 74 this week that had previously been run by Ryan Vargas. The first start of the year for the 74, but much like we saw with Garrett Smithley getting his first start of the year in the 99 car for BJ McLeod's team, mechanical issues out the gate with limited practice and limited qualifying, and of course no testing, which the Harmon team unfortunately learned the hard way after even just a show car appearance with one of their cars at Rockingham 2 years ago. Really kind of an unfortunate situation that they had these problems from the start of the race and couldn't get them worked out. Dawson Cram had to do an extra lap during the pace laps, in fact, from an unscheduled pit stop, pulled behind the wall with the issues of the fuel pump cable. But again, this team, and I think this is where it's never really shown the results. If you just look at the results and you don't watch the race and you don't hear about what's happening at the back of the field, you have no idea that any of these things are going on. And just imagine multiplying that by 38 starters or up to 40 in the Cup Series here. The CHK team, the Mike Harmon effort out there, did everything they could to get that 74 car back out there, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for that, as did with the BJ McLeod effort today in the 78 car. They were trying to find a way to get that fuel pump back working. They wanted to diagnose the issue. It wasn't just as simple as, oh, this thing's blown up, okay, load it on the truck, and it's over. In both cases, and especially with the Harmon one, they were absolutely trying everything they could to get back out there. They tried to replace the cable. They tried to find the right nut that could get it on there. They remembered, again, the situation with Joey Gase the previous week, as, of course, there was a lot on social media that the Emerling Gase team put out there showing that this particular problem was happening. I don't know if they got their first replacement cable from them, but wherever they got it, they were able to kind of bolt it back on there and complete a few more laps. Ultimately, the car lost fuel pressure again, and the 74 ended up finishing last place in the race. A little bit different from Gase's situation where the first repairs seemed to take, but just nobody else fell out of the race, and it wasn't the situation there. In this one, we did have Gray Galding fall out of the race around the same time as 74 pulled behind the wall. They could have gained a spot, but it was getting to the point they were about 40 laps down. There were about 40 laps left in the race. The repairs were going to take even longer. The second replacement cable was going to take longer to actually install. And so, unfortunately, it was a situation where they just ended up in last. And unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that happens. But still getting some points, even if it's not that many points there for the number 74 effort, getting another start for that program. hopefully in Atlanta and these other races coming up here, we'll see that team a bit more. As to the other side of it there with the BJ McLeod effort, we did not see the 99 car back out here in the Xfinity race. That car was withdrawn. Garrett Smithley went over to DGM Racing to take over for Josh Bilicki in the 91 car. I don't know if that's a permanent solution. It seems like a lot of drivers in his group are kind of moving from one ride to the next. It did seem like talking with Smithley at Fontana, he was a little bit less sure about where he stood with the BJ effort there the rest of this year versus Vargas, who was visibly very excited about what he can do in the 74 this year. I don't know if he's running the 74 this weekend in Atlanta. I know that Vargas is going to make his first truck laps in qualifying for Atlanta, which is going to be a bit hairy out there. But certainly that's something that he's very excited about for sure too. Hopefully things work out on that end with that program at the same time. I believe he is going to be still in the 74 for other races this year, but I know there's other things that they're looking at the same time. Let's see. I was going to get the rest of the Xfinity results out here. Congratulations, of course, to Sammy Smith, becoming the fourth youngest driver to win an Xfinity Series race. Did so in convincing fashion there in the final laps of it, beating Ryan Truex, who himself had a fine showing as his teammate there in the 19. I think that was really good. I think the broadcast was still pretty lackluster. I think that was definitely more on Adam Alexander's side of it there. I do think he's still a little bit too chummy with the other people in the booth, and that comes at the cost of the actual play-by-play. I think Harvick's play-by-play was fine. I thought he was responding to what was happening. But I think that, sometimes with Adam Alexander and Joey Logano, the dynamic is just not quite right. It still felt very much like Atlanta last year, where at one point I was tweeting, it's like, according to the booth, it sounds like this race is hilarious, because all I kept hearing all the time was just laughing and guffawing all the time. And I get it. Being a broadcaster is fun. You should be having fun when you're doing your job as best you can. I mean, if it's a job you're not enjoying, then you should look for something else. But I think there's a limit there with some, just a little bit more professionalism. Just reel it in a little bit. Because I know Adam Alexander is capable of that. He was good at that when he was with TNT, and he would do some decent play-by-play. But I just don't think, I can't think of a good moment that would play well in a montage that Adam Alexander has done recently, which is too bad, because I thought this Xfinity race was fantastic. I thought it was very competitive. I thought there was a lot of comers and goers through the field there. I almost said Anthony Lazzaro. Tony Sauce, good old Anthony Alfredo, was doing a great job charging through the field. He posted on social media that after he had that flat tire at the end, after getting some stage points in stage 2, that he charged away from about 30th place into 14th at the finish of that. That's fantastic. And definitely something great for the BJ McLeod team to take back with him after it was a pretty frustrating weekend on their Cup program side. I'm glad that they had a good performance out there and even got the 14th spot from Parker Kligerman on the last lap. I'm sure they had an absolute great battle out there, working their way around in the final stages of that. So good showings for him. Good recovery by Kyle Busch, as much as I'm not crazy about him being in the Xfinity Series. I will say some incredible car control out of Kyle Busch at the end, although it was at the cost of his teammate Chandler Smith, who still managed to recover and get a 5th place finish despite that there. Amazing car control at the end of that. Somebody should get him a Cup ride sometime. Imagine how good he would do at that point. And of course, there he is in the Cup Series with Richard Childress and already a winner this year. I mean, again, I still think my vision of what defines a Cup, a driver that's should be out of the Cup Series is a little bit more common sense. If you haven't checked out my latest opinion piece on that I posted last month, definitely encourage you to check it out, and definitely would love to hear your thoughts on that at the same time. I think if you're a playoff driver, that should be the first delineation there. And Kyle Busch being a playoff guy has no business being in an Xfinity ride. I don't care if it's 5 races, 3 races, 1 race. It's stupid. You want to see like amazing car control out of him. Wait till Sunday. And again, have the system it's a changing of priorities that needs to happen. There needs to be more opportunities for guys in Xfinity and truck to get in the Cup, not more opportunities for Cup guys to be working their way back down, unless they're struggling. And that's where the playoff thing, I think, is the nice dividing line. If we're going to make the playoffs so central to the sport, if they need to still be out there, at least have them do some good and keep out drivers that have absolutely no business being in there, and finally lock down the definition of what a bushwhacker is in the first place. Is a bushwhacker a driver that's, in the Cup Series? Well, am I going to be frustrated when BJ McLeod gets a great Xfinity ride, or, Cody Ware or any of these guys? Absolutely not. And when they get a good run, it should be celebrated. But, again, not to go too much further down that road, but that's kind of where I am on that. But if you check out my article on that, I break that down much more. Kyle Weatherman with another top 20 for Our Motorsports. Great job by him. We mentioned Kligerman in his 15th place run after starting 37th in a backup car. Fantastic job for him as well. Ryan Ellis snuck into the top 20 along with Jeremy Clements, kind of getting around some other drivers that were kind of falling back in the later stages. It seemed like Jeb Burton and Brandon Jones were kind of having some other struggles there at the end, and they were able to kind of snipe away a couple of spots there. Really exciting to see. I think we saw a good mix of longer runs and shorter ones at the same time there, so congratulations to them on that. Justin Allgaier unfortunately ends up in the bottom 5. Blaine Perkins, his really difficult Xfinity season continues with another bottom 5 finish, finishing in the 35th spot, and Kaz Gralla rounding out that end of the field. But again, congratulations to Sammy Smith in very short order from his transition from ARCA into the Xfinity Series here. Definitely with this win and now punching his ticket into the Xfinity Series playoffs. This can be interesting to see how much more he's able to accomplish later this year. He's having kind of the start that I expected to see out of Ty Gibbs on the Cup Series side, but unfortunately we haven't really seen that so far. As to if that's going to change or not, we're going to find out, I think, in these next couple of weeks as we get into the Super Speedway in Atlanta, the road course in COTA, and so forth from there. We're going to have some very interesting venues here coming up now that the West Coast swing has drawn to a close here from this weekend. The other one I want to mention from the Xfinity race, John Hunter Nemechek, I still think is again, I think they did a decent job tracking the fact that he was working his way back from the back of the pack. I love the detail there about them repairing the nose on the 20 car to get him back out there and drawing Supra on the tape. I thought that was pretty neat. And he almost came back and still won the race, finishing 6th place. I think everybody's got to be very concerned if they want to win this championship this year, that they may have to take it from John Hunter Nemechek. He started the year off with the runner-up finish to Austin Hill at Daytona. That momentum has continued with his win at Fontana. I think he's going to be very dangerous if he keeps up the pace that he's had. And he had a lot of attrition to deal with here. That below-the-line penalty came up again, as we saw in Las Vegas, and it sniped him here. But I thought he did a great job, and it showed a lot of perseverance, being able to come back from that and get a 6th-place run out of this, especially in a race that was as competitive as this was, and one where he did finish ahead of drivers like a Kyle Busch, like Josh Berry, who had multiple spins and wasn't quite able to get as far up in the ranking as Nemechek was. So definitely something I think that should be very exciting the further this season goes along here. So I think that'll be one thing to certainly look at the same time here. Yeah, everybody seems so sure to give this title to Cole Custer, but we haven't seen really that great performance out of Custer, even at Fontana. And I know there was an incident there with Austin Dillon that changed the complexion of that race very much, and he was looking really good until then. But other than that, that's been kind of the sole real bright spot we've seen out of that 00 team this year. So again, you could always kind of catch fire later this year, maybe get his feet under him. But I don't think we're going to see a 6 or 7 win season out of that team this year. I think you're more likely to see that out of either an Austin Hill at Childress or the 20 team there with John Hunter. I think Hill winning that Vegas race and pulling it off from Chandler Smith was a statement that he's not just a super speedway driver. And we could see at least a performance as well as we saw out of Justin Haley before he got full-time into Cup. The other one I think is definitely going to take off in Xfinity is going to be Chandler Smith. It's only going to be a matter of time till he wins. Very well could have happened at Vegas. He just got passed there at the end. That happens. Very much the same kind of thing here in the Xfinity race. Had to deal with his teammate, but still got a top 5 out of it. I think, again, if you have a Final 4 that's going to include John Hunter and Austin Hill and Chandler Smith, and pick anybody after that, probably one of the JR Motorsports guys that can't seem to get out of each other's way here these last few rounds, I think you'll have a fine showing there out of those guys. Not sure if that's exactly going to happen. We saw Austin Hill miss the cut there for the Final 4 last year. But we'll see how that shakes out. So we'll see. I'm still curious if Sam Mayer is going to break through for his first win too. I guess that's the other storyline to kind of watch here. Didn't see as much of him from this race, but hopefully we'll find out from there. I did not watch the ARCA race live, but from what I've seen, that was an absolute barn burner as well. And I need to I need to get the race results up here because I don't want to get the name of the race winner incorrect. Tyler Reif, congratulations to him on that. I think, if anything, the broadcast, from what I saw, needed to make an even bigger point out of the fact that he backed into the wall at the beginning of that race and still managed to pull off that win, leading 5 laps of that race. I mean, congratulations to him. I think ARCA is looking very strong this year. I mean, you got Greg Van Alst winning Daytona, and you got Reif winning this race. Apparently, him and his brother have both now won in this series. Tremendous accomplishment for him there, and I think that's huge there at the same time. Speaking of Alst, we saw a good performance out there. I understand Kamikaze Games got his logo on the 35 there, still finished in the top 10. Still some good runs out there. Frankie Muniz getting his first top 10 in ARCA, finishing in the 6th spot there. Great showing out of him. Kyle Keller bringing the 70 car back out there with the effort there, the Star Nursery scheme. Lots of great performances out there, and I'm very excited to see how ARCA does the rest of this year. 32 car lineup out there at the same time. I did see the mentions here at the same time, and I do want to add on to this. Well, I did hear the reports about DL Wilson being checked out at the hospital there. Certainly hope he's doing okay in his recovery. It sounded like he got banged up pretty bad there in that wreck during that race as well. But driving for the Hillenberg effort out there, I know that's a very tight-knit group over there. Andy, of course, one of the drivers that was the subject of the Field Fillers series here. Certainly hope that he's doing better, and that we'll hopefully see him back at the track here before too much longer. But again, a very physical race out there. Unfortunately, a lot of incidents at the same time too, but a very competitive race at the same time. But certainly hoping that DL is doing better in his recovery here at the same time. Another thing I want to kind of talk about on the show tonight is the rise of the road course ringers that are coming up here the next couple of weeks. We're going to see a lot more of this for the first time, and I believe this is the first time. I was asked about this earlier. Is this the first time that we've had 2 Formula One world champions running against each other in a Cup Series race? I do believe this would be by getting both Jenson Button and Kimi Räikkönen running against each other at the same time. Button apparently already involved, with, I was thinking of Jordan Taylor being involved with the Garage 56 program, and him also running in there, driving the number 9 car in place of Josh Berry and being a relief driver for Chase Elliott. But Jenson Button getting out there, and apparently from the Bob Pockrass interview, being a bit nervous about it and making this transition and trying to run these cars again. That's only good for the sport. I think that's fantastic. I think we saw a resurgence of road course drivers coming back into the sport with this next-gen car. They're intrigued by the fact that it has some modeling after what we've seen from endurance cars, at least in the lower tiers, kind of the GTs and so forth. But I'm glad that a lot of them are trying it and are interested in doing it. And drivers like Joey Hand. We've always seen a number of road course drivers, but that had been on the decline. It was very rare to get somebody from outside the sport to really try anything in the Gen 6 car. We'd seen drivers and drivers like Jacques Villeneuve who had come through there and really had, struggles at the same time. I think his last start in the Cup Series before last year was back in 2013, and they had mechanical issues on the 51 car before even starting the Sears Point race. But now we have these cars, and we have more road courses on the calendar, and we have this high-level talent. They're not going to be just battling for the last car battle here. I think they're going to actually mix it up with these guys and get some real quality rides. I think especially Jordan Taylor in that 9 car, as I said earlier this week, that's going to be worth the price of admission right there. I'm getting vibes off of that, like Ron Fellows and Boris said, getting into quality rides at Sears Point in 2003. And I hate that Chase Elliott's going to be missing that race. Him, of course, being a driver that's been very good at that track and being a factor in those events. But at the same time, again, that's going to be a top quality ride. That's going to have a top quality driver in there. And we could see somebody able to kind of mix things up and make things interesting. I'm glad to see Raikkonen back. I'm glad to see Project 91 back with him. I think that effort to try to bring more international drivers in there and drivers with, similar experience into the sport. I hope they make an appearance at Sears Point. I hope we see a lot more out of these programs coming up here too. And I think that'll be very exciting. So I think that's going to be fantastic. And we'll find out if that's going to be a situation there too. Is it okay for a road course ringer to take a regular Cup driver's seat? Good question, A79 iRock. I mean, I didn't mind it back in the day because I thought it was just something that made things kind of interesting. And I just kind of believed that there were a lot of drivers that just didn't like the road courses, where you had drivers like Jimmy Spencer and so forth that just, that's always the example that comes up is drivers that prefer the ovals. Today, I don't think we have drivers in this field that are feeling that same way. I think we have a lot of drivers that look forward to the road courses. They want to run them. And we have drivers that really do enjoy running them. I think that's a fair point. I think I would have less of a problem with it if there was a more sustainable system for open teams to get back out there. Obviously the Jordan Taylor thing, that's an injury. There's nothing to do with, anything of like, there's nobody's certainly saying that Chase Elliott isn't capable of winning road courses as he has. Of course, his first win coming at Watkins Glen and so forth. But I do think that, if we had something more sustainable where these guys could run open cars or additional open cars from chartered efforts like we had with Travis Pastrana earlier this year, I think that would be okay. I still think these 4 extra spots we have open, I just treat them like, those are free real estate for any of these guys to get back out there. And it's just not happening because it's just not sustainable. And this kind of ties in a little bit with a bit of another controversy from this week. And that was Carl Long addressing the questions about Brian Weber getting in the 66 car on the Xfinity Series side. Long was very transparent about how much it costs to get these cars out there and the ludicrous amount of money that it takes to get a Cup Series car out there. A driver that is an international competitor that maybe brings their own sponsors on there could be somebody that could make that work, but it takes that amount of money to be able to make that happen. It's a little bit less money in the Xfinity Series. But again, I had no issue with a guy like Brian Weber who hasn't run an Xfinity race since 2003. Those are kind of stories that are interesting, and it would have been great if he made the show. And then of course, when they were struggling and when they have as limited practice as they have, which is another reason that does need to be extended, that Weber was struggling out there in the 66, and this is again on the Xfinity Series side. They put Timmy Hill in the car and try to get the best run they can get. And Carl's done that before, and Carl and Timmy have worked very well together. And if they qualified that car and Timmy got this car into the race, more power to him. But I think second guessing the business decisions that Carl's had to make, trying to put whoever can get in that car and whoever's bringing the money that they can use to get the car back out there, they're doing the same thing that every one of these teams can do. It's just the success rate's just not quite been there this first part of the year, and I hate to see them struggle. I hate that they missed the show here like they did with Mason Maggio back over at Vegas. But sometimes that happens. And we have a very, very competitive Xfinity Series field. I think it's very easy to second guess the decisions of any of these teams that are finding themselves on the outside looking in. But I don't think there's any, just because it's easy to complain about this and criticize that, I don't think they're doing anything wrong. I think they're just trying to respond to this as best as they can and get the best, whether the best funding or the best shot that they have to qualify for these races. And if, if it was Timmy Hill every week, they put Timmy Hill in there every week if they had the funding, but that's just not happening. And it's got to be both those halves of it. So I don't like that Carl got a lot of criticism from that. I think a lot of that was pretty unfounded. It was too bad in that situation, but I think that's another story that kind of came up from this weekend. I hate that Weber didn't make the show, but again, that's part of it, and that's the risk you have to run when you're running one of these lower funded efforts. They certainly don't want to miss any of these races any more than they want to qualify for the race and finish in last place. I mean, they don't. They want to try to get the best possible showing that they can get out of it, and then try to build on it from one race to the next. And it's I know it's frustrating at the beginning of these seasons where you've missed more races than you've started, and you got to wonder, okay, what are we going to still try to go next week to Atlanta or Coda and after that, or do we sit out a couple of these races and just try to cherry pick the ones that we can be competitive at? I mean, these are the decisions that have to be made. But I think the problem comes in on the social media side where it's viewed as like, oh, it's obvious. It's an easy decision. Obviously, you should have done this. I don't think it's that obvious. And I applaud Carl for being so transparent in this and giving people the numbers and saying, look, if you were given this information, what do you think would have been the obvious choice? So that's kind of where I am with that. So that's kind of where all that is too. So yeah, exactly. But let's see here. Jensen is with Garage 56. Okay, thank you, Ryan Idias. So that does kind of tie in with that too. Let me get into the super chats here. I want to make sure I read those off here before the rest of this. Bowser Jr. XD, last Burton win was Fall Charlotte 2008. Yes, thank you for reminding me there. Yes, so 2008. So it was a couple years after that. So he still had the singular car, or the AT&T car at that point, I guess, But yeah, the 2006 one, that Dover one, that one stands out because I remember, I think, I don't want to blame the wrong person, but it was somebody in the media that brought this up, and it just completely just ticked him off, and he went out there and he just stormed to that win. I was wondering if Blaney was going to do the same thing. Didn't quite shake out there, but that was another one. But yes, thank you for the super chat on that for sure. Michael Jensen, thank you for your super chat as well. Congrats to Josh Berry with his first top 10. Pretty easy last place finish for today in Xfinity. Any idea if 33 cars on the lead lap for Xfinity is a record? I don't know if that's a record there, Michael. I think that I'm trying to remember how many were at that Talladega race last fall, because we pretty much we had very few cars that were out of the race. We didn't have anybody that was out of the race. But I think we had most of the field like in one draft still, which was kind of amazing. I think that would be the other thing to kind of look at. Let me look at that one, just kind of get a starting point for that statistic. Okay, not that many. It was still 23 cars on the lead lap for that one. You definitely have cars that are not able to keep up with the draft that kind of fall off pace. But yeah, that's another one to kind of look at there at the same time. So, yep, still seeing shots from Victory Lane. Let me see if Pockrass has already had an announcement or anything on inspection. Not seeing anything here. Owner points, interviews with Blaney, and so forth. These are just posted about 15, 20 minutes ago. So that's the latest updates on that. Alrighty. Let's see here. Oh, let me just jump down here at the same time. Yeah, 31 car didn't go to the CAT scheme until 2009. Yeah, I think you're right on that. Yeah, teams investing more into road course racing. Yeah. So, but again, let's see here. Let me do this. Okay, I'm just going to check on my other notes on this. So again, pending the results of post-race inspection, it will be another BJ McLeod article, which would be his first last-place run since Loudon last year. And that's going to be the big story on that side there. That again, the Xfinity article on Dawson Cram is already on the site. So if you haven't checked that out, that'll be on there at the same time. I'm still really very happy with the NASCAR Drive thing, the onboard cameras. And it certainly was a factor at the same time with the actual the camera catching the incident there between Chastain and Hamlin at the finish. So kudos to the person that posted that as well. I think I retweeted that earlier. Yes, at 901 Joshy on Twitter. Big thanks to him on that for posting that. And then Noli was the one that sent the message at the same time there. I was interested, Lucas Oil Products. That was the other thing too. I guess I'll probably finish on this here too. We very nearly had another sponsor breakthrough in this race here. And of course, it's unfortunate with Harvick missing out on the victory, again, pending post-race inspection here, that it was going to be the 40th start for Hunt Brothers Pizza, which has been in the NASCAR's Cup Series, at least on the Cup Series side, since 2008, when Ken Schrader was sponsored, had that sponsor for a Haas. What was it? It was back to the Haas team before Stewart acquired that program. So actually, pretty much staying within the program for a lot of that time. They have won in the Xfinity and the Truck Series, including with Harvick, I believe, in both of them. But they'd never finished better than fourth in a Cup Series race. I still kind of believe that there's some paint schemes that just seem to have terrible luck, and they just can't quite win. I put Joey Logano's AAA paint scheme in that group. And back when Kyle Busch was with Gibbs, his pedigree paint scheme certainly had terrible luck. I think they had at least two situations where they had loose wheels come off the car coming off of pit road. But in this particular case here, the Hunt Brothers car almost broke through. It would have been their first win in their 40th attempt. It would have been with the 4 car, which would have been a nice repeat from what we saw with the Lucas Oil paint scheme and their 80th start in the 8 car with Kyle Busch, and that one did break through. But here, unfortunately, Kevin Harvick not quite able to pull off the victory. I do think that he's definitely served notice that he's going to be a good factor for a race later this year. But I know the other problem, and especially with like older drivers, you never know when it's really your last shot at it. You don't know if it's going to be your last opportunity to actually pull off a victory there because, things, may not turn out. But we did see him, Harvick come out very late last year and pull off those wins there at Richmond and Michigan, and to the point where people were wondering if he was going to be a championship favorite going into those last 10 races. Who knows what can happen? Things could be, we know that we can't use the Hail Melon, but we do know that, the possibility is there. So hopefully Harvick fans aren't too disappointed in that outcome. I know it's frustrating, but I think that it's, if nothing else, that the positive thing on that is this going to be a very interesting story for us to be following here in the coming weeks. So that'll be it here for that. So that's going to be about where we're going to leave it on the show here today. We're not going to do trivia tonight. We'll bring that back next week for our Atlanta show. We'll have plenty to be talking about there. I'm going to wrap up a little bit earlier this evening here, but I appreciate you guys all staying tuned in for Behind the Wall. Our next, at Last Car on Brock, at Last Car on Brock is my Twitter feed. Patreon.com/LastCarOnBrock is the Patreon. And my website, of course, is lastcar.info. Stay tuned as well. One thing I've been working on very much this week is another video to be posted on this channel. I think you guys are very much going to be enjoying it here. Those of you who are in the Patreon know what the subject of that video is. I'd like to get it done this week, if I could, to at least have Patreon access. So more content for the channel coming up here very soon. And I hope to have more information on that very soon there. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a great evening. Our next show is going to be after Atlanta next Sunday, which will be tracking the Truck Series, Xfinity Series, and Cup Series at the Super Speedway. It'll be a packed show. We'll bring back the trivia section that night, and we'll have a good time on there. So definitely stay tuned then. So thank you again for tuning in, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time.